Hello, fellow foodies, and welcome to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. So, how many of you love getting out in the water? Well, my special guest today is not only a colleague, but also a dear friend that first introduced me to the joys of wild swimming, including in some very cold places. Like me, Susanne is an ethnobotanist and knows a lot about some of really interesting wild edible plants, including some plants found in various aquatic habitats. She has written a fabulous new book called Wild Waters, a wildlife and water lover's companion to the aquatic world. So, before we jump in, let me tell you a little bit more about Susanne Masters. She has published academic research on wildlife trade and has written features for the New York Times, the Guardian newspaper, BBC, and other outlets. She also works with distilleries and spas on ingredient selection and developing sustainable supply chains. In Wild Waters, Susanne reveals the connections between people, wildlife, and wild landscapes in Britain and Ireland. It's so great to see you today, Susanne. How are things going?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to see you. And, I just loved your book. It's not only just, gorgeously written, but also beautifully illustrated with amazing drawings of these different aquatic habitats. And one of the habitats that has fascinated me for a long time is that of the kelp forest. So, what can you tell us about kelp? What is kelp, first of all, and where do we find it?
So kelp are a group of seaweeds, and they're sort of within the seaweeds get grouped by green, red, brown, and you also have some things that we call seaweeds, but they're actually vascular plants. So
Hmm.
they're more familiar if you're on land. But the seaweeds are quite different. They don't have roots and veins in the way that we're used to plants on land having. And the kelps, they're quite big. So some of them can be fully grown. They'll be taller than me. And the ones we have around Britain and Ireland, they make kelp beds. So they'll grow really densely and abundantly. And you'll find other forms of life within them. But if you're paddling over them on a stand-up paddleboard or a kayak, or if you're swimming over them and popping down to look around them, the feeling's a bit like an underwater forest in that you've got these tall, very obviously dominant kind of organisms, but then amidst them, you get all other kinds of life in amongst them. And we've got sort of a few main species. Down south, we have furbelows, and we also have a bit of cuvee kelp. And coming over from the Mediterranean Sea, which is a bit warmer, we started getting golden kelp moving in. And then also you've got sugar kelp, which is kind of long, broad ribbons, and it does actually have a sweet flavor. When it dries, you'll see this powdery white stuff on it, which is mannitol. So there's quite a bit of diversity in the kelps and the forms a kelp forest takes. But cuvee kelp's really interesting because it has this long stipe, which is a bit like the trunk on a tree. If you were kind of trying to understand what kelp's like, it has a holdfast that kind of clings onto the rock and looks a bit like that with some modifications. And then you have what looks like a trunk, which is the stipe coming up, and then you have the blades. So that's where you see a lot of movement in the water. And with some of the kelps, the stipe is quite smooth, so you don't get many other things growing on it because it's quite difficult to get a purchase. And also some of the kelps, they shed their stipes, and they don't live very long. So maybe they live 5 years or something. But cuvee kelp can live for up to 20 years, and it's got quite a rough stipe. So you'll actually get lots of other seaweeds growing off the side of it. So it's really like in a rainforest when you see epiphytes growing on the branches of trees. So kelp beds have these really, really rich layers of life just inhabiting them. And that's
so cool.
that's even before you get into all the animals. So you get like certain kinds of crabs that like to live in the holdfast, and that's where they live. And you get sort of fish nurseries. So, open water is quite a scary, dangerous place if you're a little fish or juvenile fish. So often their eggs will be laid, or juvenile fish will kind of aggregate and hide around seaweeds because it gives them shelter from predators, as well as being a place where they can find things to eat.
That's amazing. So what depths do we usually find kelp at? Is it closer to the shoreline, or can they grow kind of in deeper waters?
So they need sunlight to be able to photosynthesize. So in water that's a bit more murky and churned up, you don't get them growing so deep. And there's some kelps. So cuvee kelp, you can see it sometimes at the low tide line, and it's not furbelows, because cuvee kelp's got like more of a bend in its stipe when it's a bit high and dry because the tide's dropped. Sugar kelp, you don't really find it above the tide line. It's just that little bit deeper. It doesn't like to be exposed so much. And around the coast here in Dorset, and certainly of some islands around Scotland, you can just kind of almost be knee deep in the water and you can pick some nice fresh kelp. But out at St Kilda, so St Kilda's an archipelago of islands right out towards our west, so on the way towards America, and there's deep ocean around there, and the water's really clear. You haven't got rivers from land bringing down sediment. There isn't so much sand churned up. There's not any pollution out there because no one lives there full time now. The last villages were evacuated in the 1930s. And out there, you can get kelps growing at kind of 40 meters deep because the water's clear. They can get the light that they need.
That's fascinating. So you mentioned, going out and collecting kelp. And what do people collect kelp for? Do they use all different types of kelp, or are there certain ones used for different functions?
So with seaweeds, they have different textures and forms, and for every kind of seaweed, the form it takes, it's best used in terms of as a food, kind of in relation to its form and shape. So some of them are quite tough, and you wouldn't eat them raw, and you wouldn't be putting them in salads. Like sea lettuce is quite dainty, can be sort of 1 cell thick, so it's really fine. You can just chop it and eat it. Whereas kelps are quite thick. You would struggle to even bite a piece off because they're kind of tough and rubbery. But what you can do with kelps is use some of them. They add a lot of umami flavor, especially sugar kelp, because it's got that sweet, salty combination going on. So you'll put a bit in a stew, or if you're doing pit cooking, so where like if you dig a pit, burn wood in there, get down to the coal bed, and then you put food on it, then cover it and leave it to cook over several hours. Sugar kelp especially is great for pit cooking because you've got this long, sort of can be a couple of meters long band of seaweed, and you wrap it around if you've got some venison or fish or something that you don't want to make contact with the coals, and you want to keep some moisture in with whatever you're cooking. So you just wrap it around like a bandage, lay it on the coals, and then when you unearth it, it's kind of really nice and moist. It hasn't got ash or anything on it, and it's got a bit of that nicely salted sea flavor on it too. So it's
nice.
It's kind of tasty and a useful cooking tool.
It's like a very natural version of sea salt with using that. That's great. That's great. And now I also heard that there's another way that sugar kelp is being used in the industry. And I heard it had to do with a certain type of gin. Is that right?
It does. And so I think it's about 7 years ago, I was asked to work on ingredient selection for a distillery up on the Isle of Harris. So I went up there and I looked around and I looked at the long history there of people using seaweed as a resource, because the island is fairly isolated. So seaweed's important there, and it's used in crofting, which is small scale farming. And in order to fertilize the soil, people were getting seaweeds that would get washed up on the tide line. You put it on, and it's a great fertilizer. It also forms where the seaweed in the crofting landscape, you get these kind of flowery meadows. It's short grass, lots of flowers, because in crofting you rotate between the animal grazing, growing potatoes where you're plowing up the ground, so you're not getting in shrubs taking over. And then you'll have fallow years as well, where it's not great, it's left to rest. And you'll get these really flowery meadows called maca. And that's quite rare. It's rarer than rainforest. You only get it in small areas of northwest Ireland and Scotland. And it's formed partially because of that fertilization of the soil with the seaweeds. So, seaweed was really important to the island. And there's a big legal case between the Isle of Harris and the Isle of North Uist, which is just south. And they had a court case over a rock that was in between them. No one actually wanted the rock. What they wanted was the right to harvest the seaweed that was growing just below the surface around that rock, because it was so valuable. So seaweeds were really important. And also working with the distillery, we were looking at, well, how much, this isn't small scale. This could be 20,000 liters of gin a year. So that's a lot of ingredients. So you don't want to start with something, from an island or small area, make that part of your branding. And then after a couple of years, you can't make enough for your product, or you can't get enough for your product. And also you don't want to damage the ecosystem that's around, your identity and the distillery. So seaweed can be harvested really sustainably if you hand harvest. So it's like going into a forest and selectively cutting out individuals. So you would take individual blades, and sugar kelp, if you don't cut it all the way to the bottom, if you cut the upper section, the bottom part will carry on growing. So you can harvest sugar kelp, but the integrity of the forest is maintained. So,
nice.
So it's not like, the analogy would be like if you went in and got timber by felling every single tree in sight, that's not sustainable. If you do that with a forest, or if you do it with an underwater forest, a kelp bed. But if you go in and selectively harvest mature individuals, you can carry on doing that indefinitely, because the integrity of the kelp bed is still there. So it's sustainable. And also, always with distilleries and spas and things, there's, people want to have something new and different as well as of the place. And no one was using seaweed in gin at all at the time. There were a few now. So I was thinking, yes, seaweed, sugar kelp, and I knew there was sugar kelp around there, and also the flavor is quite soft. And with whiskey, so the distillery wasn't actually built. There's no physical structure there. But they knew what the whiskey was going to taste like, because you think about what barrels you're going to use, and you buy them in, and you mix bourbon and sherry barrels, and you know quite well what the flavor profile of the whiskey will be. So I'd seen the flavor profile for the whiskey that wasn't made yet.
Okay.
There's no whiskey, there's no spirit even. There's no barrels there yet. They just had their shopping list for barrels. So I knew the flavor profile of the whiskey, and to try and connect with that, I made the gin match that softness that was projected to be in the whiskey, so that it would be a natural partner with the whiskey, which was yet made.
That's a really common kind of trend though, right? A lot of new distilleries will start with gin and as a more rapid to market product, and then move to whiskey because it takes more years to age. What's the name of this particular sugar kelp infused gin?
This one's the Isle of Harris gin.
Olive Harris gin.
Yeah.
So foodies out there, if you want to taste a really unique gin, this is one that's got some lovely sugar kelp in it. So a bit of the sea along with your drink. Well, let's talk about some other aquatic creatures. One I wanted to touch on is one that I think many of the listeners have probably tasted at some point. Watermint. What is the deal with watermint? Why does it taste a little bit different from the mint you might buy in the shop, like a peppermint or spearmint?
Okay, so I did a little rummage in my winter garden. So this is the south coast of England, but it is December, so things are kind of tuckered down for the winter. But even so, I did have a little bit of spearmint. It's quite
Oh,
little.
look at that. Yeah. Okay.
And then I also yanked out of my pond. I did pull out a piece of watermint. So what you can see is it's dripping. Um,
Uh-huh.
the leaves now in its winter form, so it's cold, so it's really hunkering down, and the water surface is about here, so it's barely coming out.
Mhm.
Whereas in summer it can be sort of knee high or more because it
Oh,
grows up.
really?
So this is my water mint growing in the pond like this, kind of really tucked down for the winter. And also, sometimes you'll get an air frost, but the water isn't going to freeze because it's got more latent energy. So it takes a lot colder temperatures to freeze. So it'll actually carry on growing and making fresh green growth just underneath the surface of the water through the winter.
Interesting.
And this one, even just touching it like this, I haven't broken a leaf at all. Um, but it's really smelling incredibly strong. Um, this is because these leaves growing along the water, they're sort of when you brush against them, they release a lot more aroma. Whereas this spearmint, there's a leaf on the spearmint, it's actually quite tough, and
Mm.
you can see there something's been eating it. Uh, Even this spearmint growing in my garden, one of the reasons, supermarket mint or grocery store mint doesn't taste the same is because the stuff growing out here has environmental pressures. And in this case, this is some insect damage. They've been chomping. And so much of the flavor profile of plants comes from it's their array of defensive weapons against things eating them, to protect them from intense UV light. Water mint doesn't do this because water mint grows in very damp ground or running water. So water mint doesn't really grow in places where it completely dries out. But some plants, some of the chemicals they make are cooling, so it's a bit like sweating when it's hot. They can release volatile oils and cool themselves. So
Hmm.
one of the reasons supermarket mint tastes so different to water mint is because the environmental pressures that it's lived under. And the other reason, I'm going to show you a different species of mint again. So the spearmint is Mentha spicata. The water mint is Mentha aquatica. So those names are quite easy to remember. And then here I have, it's quite dainty. This is what, a lot of people call Corsican mint. And it's really, really kind of
Really tiny. Yeah.
tiny.
Uh-huh.
It creeps along. So this one's Mentha requieni. Um, and these are three entirely different species. And, alongside the differences you see in the leaf shape, what you're also getting is you're getting differences in the chemical composition on the basis of they make different volatile chemicals within themselves, or they produce them at different concentrations when you compare different species together. So all of these mints smell minty. This one, the Corsican mint, if you do get it and you smell it, if you've ever raided, the unloved bottles on a shelf of liqueurs or things, this is going to remind you of creme de menthe, and it is a species that is used in creme de menthe.
In
Uh,
creme de menthe.
yeah,
Okay. Wow.
spearmint is. It's quite a toothpastey smell because
Toothpaste, okay. Yeah.
it's actually mimicked in toothpaste. As we think of that as that like clean, fresh, minty smell. Watermint is different. I mean, when you rub it, it's just so much more aromatic, and it's kind of almost a bit fruity. So
Oh, interesting.
it's probably got more carvone in it than the spearmint, and it's
Mm.
also in the summer. Its winter smell is a bit different, but in the summer, it's almost a little almost floral, which is
Oh,
perhaps
interesting.
yeah. So
Yeah.
all of these three are edible. There are some mints that you shouldn't eat. So pennyroyal is thought to be hepatotoxic, so that's damaging to your liver.
Ooh,
Um,
liver. Mhm.
yeah, and that's menthopuligium. Kind of have to picture the word to pronounce it. Puligium, um,
Mhm.
and that does grow in damp meadows here, but it's quite rare, so you're unlikely to pick it by accident. But yeah, so mints are a lot of them are very tasty. A couple you have to be careful with.
Yeah, that's great. Well, when you're talking about the kind of supermarket, grocery chain, version of mints that are sold, they're almost like overly pampered. These are grown in very pampered conditions, so not out dealing with, herbivores or insect predation or other pests that, you know, get them really pumping up those defense compounds that give it those lovely volatile, aromas and flavors. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
I
cool.
mean, you can also if you buy mint from a supermarket in a pot,
Mhm.
um, you leave it on your windowsill. Just forget to water it for a couple of days. Like push it to the brink and then water it at the last minute. Make sure it gets the sun beating down on it, and give it a couple of weeks of not pampering, and it'll get tasty.
There you go. I'm very good at abusing my houseplant, so I'll have to try that with with the mint. So I know one of your other gifts, Suzanne, in addition to like really getting out and exploring the natural world, is really an amazing palette for ways of preparing these wild foods as either beverage ingredients or foods. What is your preferred way to consume watermint?
Oh, watermint. Do you know it makes a great mint julep? It
Ah,
really does. Yeah, yeah. Um, just because of the kind of almost floral note of it. It's so aromatic in the glass, and of course, if you don't want to drink alcohol, you can actually, instead of using a bourbon, over here I usually use Scotch whiskey, but there's not much exciting bourbon here. You can use a little bit of cold iced tea, just a dash, and
hmm.
then kind of substitute that in for the whiskey, and it will just kind of work nicely with the flavors because you get a bit of astringency from the tea.
Hmm.
Um, both are good.
That's great. So mint juleps or a teetotaler version with iced tea. I like that. That's great. Well, this brings me on to another food, but we're going to jump over to some other kinds of creatures. And these are kind of slippery, slimy creatures that most people, I think today, probably don't think of as food, but historically were hugely important as a local food source. Let's talk about eels, European eels. What did you learn in your research for the book about these eels?
Do you know? I have to say, even before I wrote the book, eels they're just such fascinating fish. Um, I remember seeing one. I was walking the dog down at Virginia Water, so near London, and I saw something go across the grass, and I was like, "What? That's such a monster snake! Oh my god!" And then I kind of looked more, and I realized it was an eel. So sometimes eels, when they're following their migratory paths, that there isn't water there. If it's damp, they'll glide across it.
Wow.
Yeah, they're just amazing like that. And eels have been really important in England for a very long time. In fact, even as far back as medieval times, eels were serious because you could pay your rent in eels, sticks of eels. So one
Wow.
stick, you would catch eels and dry them, and then you would put them on a stick. So one stick was a lot more than one eel, and we know this because the sort of landed gentry, the people in power, they were very careful about keeping records of what the peasants owed them. Uh, so now we know, like, you can actually look back and see, poor Owain had to pay like 20 sticks of eels rent for his house plus some money as well. I mean, so eels were really popular as a food, and we actually ate too many of our eels because if you look at the sort of archaeological remains, the size of the eel bones you find in waste heaps and things was actually getting slightly smaller. And often that's an indication of an unsustainable harvest because you're not getting individuals living to maturity. So we started shipping in eels from Holland, and the Dutch started bringing us eels. And you can look at maps of London from 1600s, and on the map, there's drawing City of London, there's boats in the river, and you can even see some of those boats underneath it's written, eel boats. So they were really a feature of the landscape here. And someone even invented a kind of barge where there's a hold and there was water maintained in it so the eels could be brought over fresh, because that was even more delicious and more what people wanted. So eels have been very popular. And then also in London, we had the pie and mash shops. So it was eel pie and mashed potato. Not partly, taste change, but also we really don't have that many eels now. And it's not just because we've been eating them. So all eels, even the farmed eels, are born out in the Sargasso Sea. So that's way over towards the Caribbean. And no one's managed to get eels to breed and then manage to get sort of the elvers, which is baby eels, to live more than a few days. They're really, really wild, and we haven't worked out how to farm them. So you can buy eel to eat, and it'll be, often if you talk to the supplier, they'll tell you what's farmed. But every farmed eel has been a baby eel that was caught from the wild and then moved into the farms. And there's, eels, because they're migratory, they don't live in one country. And in some countries, they're legally allowed to be harvested. And in some countries, some countries moving to saying, well, it's not really working out for the eels. And it's not just because we eat them. The problem is how we've changed our water courses. So if you remember, the eels, they breed in the Sargasso Sea, but that's really far away, and they live in our lakes and rivers until they're ready to breed. So they have to get there, and with dams, that creates a barrier, so they can't, when the young eels looking for their ancestral river to go and live in, they can't get up there. And then also, if they are up there, depending on the water height, there might not be enough water for them to reach all the way back to the sea. And even hydroelectric dams, there are problems because the eels get caught in the machinery, and they don't survive that necessarily. So one of the ways that eels people are trying to help them is by creating pathways for them. So where there are power generation schemes looking at, well, how can we stop eels slipping through into machinery, and also can we provide ladders and channels for them to travel up, because they're actually listed by the IUCN as I think they're endangered, possibly critically endangered. So they're actually, and that means that if things don't change, the trajectory of their population, if it continues the way it has, in a generation, there won't be eels. So we have to actually try and help them. And a big part of that is it's not just thinking really carefully about eating them. It's also undoing the changes we've made to the landscape, which has been really unfavorable for eels.
Yeah. What's interesting with like the little animal crossings, but an aquatic animal
Mhm.
crossing is a neat
Mhm.
idea. And I'm just thinking of like the types of foods where I've encountered eels before. And I think really I've only seen eel on the menu um, from places that I've eaten recently, just in sushi as like a small bit in a sushi
Yeah,
roll or an eel sauce. But again, I never realized that they were actually born wild and then farmed. That's a
yeah,
challenge. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, another interesting creature you write about in your book is something called a snake lock anemone. Am I saying that right? What what do those look like? Are those migratory or do they kind of stay in one place?
They pretty much stay in one place when they're adults, so they attach themselves to rocks. They're squidgy all over. Kind of imagine a jellyfish, but stuck on a rock with the tentacles going up. They're
Okay.
not just they're fairly closely related. But anemones, the snake locks anemones, you get two forms. So you get one where it's kind of more beige gray colored, and then you get some where um, you can see the body and the tentacles are quite greenish.
Mhm.
Um, and those ones that are green, they have a lot more green fluorescent protein in them. Um, so you might know green fluorescent protein
Oh,
as
like the scientific tools, GFP, glue yeah, oh, that's really cool. This is
yeah,
our glow in the dark kind of stuff we use in science to track how different genes work. Yeah.
exactly. So, and it was originally for science. It was extracted from a jellyfish, from a crystal jellyfish.
Mhm.
But it's that green fluorescent protein is present in a lot of cnidarians, which is the kind of larger grouping that anemones and jelly, are within. Um, and the green fluorescent protein, it's a tool, so it tells you like if gene is being expressed because you can see it because you just expose it to UV light and you get fluorescence. So you can
Mm.
literally just turn the lights off, get it to fluoresce, and what you expect it to be in there is there. So they're really part of you know, medical treatments actually, and our understanding of bodies and cells. Without green fluorescent protein, would probably be quite different still. And that's why for the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, I think in 2008, that was awarded for work on green fluorescent protein. That's how important it is to us, from these little squidgy creatures. Um, but they've also had other uses as well, more niche uses. So in Spain, after the Spanish Civil War, the sort of availability of food was restricted by government policy on agricultural production, and also there was food rationing as well, and so people were kind of looking for food, and one of those foods of necessity was the snake locks anemone. You can
Hmm.
just go pull them off the rocks and dust them with flour and then deep fry them, and then you've got something that fills up your belly, and it's got a bit of nutrition in it. And the other place in the Mediterranean where they've been eaten is Sardinia. So, we think of Sardinia as an island, and you assume big kind of fishing cultures attached to islands. But actually, not always in Sardinia. Actually, historically, a lot of the people who moved there were farmers, and they were, up in the central mountains, away from the sort of mosquito and malarial plains and lowlands.
Mm.
Um, so they weren't necessarily going out and fishing, but if you're on a shoreline, one of those kind of literal foods, so that's kind of easy to find along coast, is reach in, pull them out, and then deep fry them and eat them.
So
In some places, they've been a food of necessity, or often what sort of people looking at these kinds of foods will call them famine foods. things that people eat when they're like really desperate. Although if you go to restaurants around Cadiz, you'll find snake books and anemones there on a fancy menu now.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then in
Yeah.
Sardinia, they were kind of like a practical food, like you can just grab it. You don't need a boat or anything. You don't need sailing skills. It's accessible. We'll take it.
Interesting. That's one I definitely haven't tried before. Well, I guess one last topic I want to jump into before we wrap up is, what is your advice for people that are interested in exploring more of these aquatic habitats? How do you do so, not only in a way that's safe for you, but also safe for the creatures that you're encountering? Like, how do we do this in a safe and kind of non-impact way?
So, I mean, for creatures, basically, you know, you're going to get better at watching things without disturbing them because you start to realize that the distance you want to keep is probably bigger than you initially think. So, if you're looking at coastal birds and then they all fly up, they're flying up because you disturbed them. So then you start to gauge, actually, I should stay further back and use binoculars. And,
Mm.
things like seals on land, they're really vulnerable. They can't move that easily. So if you have a dog with you, your dog should be on the lead. And also with seals, you shouldn't go up close to them when they're on land. Now, when you're swimming, sometimes they'll come to you.
Mm.
You're swimming along and then you're looking down and along the bottom, there's this seal going underneath, looking up at you, like eyeballing you from below. They just kind of like swoop past. But in that case, they're such, elegant, competent swimmers. They're way faster than you and their maneuverability is amazing. So they're feeling, they're not feeling vulnerable, but they are curious. So they're popping down, taking a look, but they're to move around. So it's, you have to think about not cornering animals, not disturbing them at sensitive times. So, for birds, that's bird nesting time. So here we have fulmars, and if you the British Mountaineering Council, reminds people where the key nesting places are on the cliffs, and reminds people don't go climbing there. But if you do make the mistake of going climbing there and you disturb a fulmar in its nest, it will puke on you. Really stinky.
That's a good deterrent.
You will not do that again. You will respect fulmars because they let you know, don't do this to us. But they shouldn't have to. So you should be careful around that. And also the flip side of that is for us, we breathe air, not water. So we have vulnerability around water. And actually, a lot of the times people get into trouble can be when they're not expecting to be in the water. So you're near,
Mm.
you can slip on a muddy path, or you don't understand the local conditions. So here in England, the tidal range is quite big in some places. So certainly on the East Anglian coast and some sections of the Cumbrian coast, you can be on what you think is sort of sandy beach and the sea's quite far away. But when the tide changes, it comes in really fast. And
Mm.
you can be quite far away from land and in very rapidly rising water. So that's where you need to talk with local people and know the tide times. And then it's so variable because here we don't have sneaker waves, but you do get them in Oregon and California, I think Iceland as well. So a sneaker wave is when you can be along the seashore like 20 minutes or something, and there's just small gentle waves, and you'll see that bit of foam, like the limit of where the water gets to, and a sneaker wave will come out of nowhere, and it can be like more than 40 meters further in. So there's just a big wave, and that's because Oregon and California and Iceland, there's really deep sea before the coast. and that seems to create these sneaker waves. Whereas here in Britain, we don't have that because we have a loch up in Scotland, Loch Morar, and that loch's 310 meters deep. That's deeper than most of the sea around us. Like there's only some out towards St Kilda where it's deeper. So our surrounding sea is quite shallow. So we don't get sneaker waves. But if there's a storm front, the weather forecast will often tell people, don't go along the beach edge taking photos of the big dramatic waves because they'll come and squash you too. So that's like, they'll be on the forecast and that's sort of predicted. Whereas sneaker waves, it's more about the landscape and being aware of that place and the kind of the seabed conditions that are offshore. So, and in both cases, it's that local knowledge, talk to local people, look up tide times, check weather forecasts, because also on rivers, a river in full spate because there's heavy rainfall around you, or heavy rainfall up in the mountains or upstream, and then that's collected together and it comes down in a surge. A river on an average day can be calm and gentle, but then when it gets into full spate, it's a lot of powerful water coming down with debris and with a lot of speed. So it's also understanding that outside conditions aren't static. So you're checking, on a day, even for me, my local beach, I swim here all the time and go out on the paddleboard and go along the seashore walking. But, there are certain times when there's winds coming into the land. So winds from the south, bringing up the wave height, when I won't swim because I know that right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such good advice, just to be aware and like talk to people, figure out what the danger zones are. That's huge. Well, I do want to leave with one last recipe. I asked this of many of my guests, if you have a favorite recipe, maybe from an aquatic plant or another plant, we can open it up because I know you have a lot of really great recipes that you could share. What's your favorite, maybe for the season?
For the season, at the moment, for the winter season, I have to say, every time you drink whiskey, there's actually an aquatic plant, a bulrush that's used to create the seal in the whiskey. So I would say, at this time of year where maybe it's a little cold, I would say if you have a little tot of whiskey, do a little toast towards the bulrush that has actually, because with whiskey, we always talk about the grain and the barrel, but there's this kind of quiet, unassuming bulrush that makes the barrel watertight. So, a little toast to give thanks to the bulrush that,
yeah, that's great. I like that. I will definitely toast the bulrush tonight. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Susanne, for coming on the show. This has been really informative.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. We are in season 4 now of the show, and you can find this and all of our other episodes at our website at foodiepharmacology.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcast and basically any podcast streaming service that you go to. You can also find the video episode of this episode and any of our more recent episodes from season 3 at the Teach Ethnobotany YouTube channel. Thanks so much to our producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth, for all the amazing work they do. And thanks to you, all our listeners, for tuning in each week. Stay healthy out there. Toast the bulrush this weekend. And I'll see you later.